In this presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the legend of Jerusha Howe. So I'm going to start by reading a story that was written in 1887 in a magazine that tells a story about Jerusha Howe. And then after I read that story, I'm going to tell you about the real Jerusha Howe. And we're going to compare this story with the facts that we know about her life so we can figure out what's truth and what's legend. The story you're about to hear is titled Jerusha Howe Spinster. Now, before I begin, I want to caution kids out there who are under the age of, I'd say about 11. It's not a scary story, but there are some references to things in there that might not be appropriate for younger kids, so please make sure you check with your families to make sure that it's okay to listen to the story. It was 2 summers ago that I chanced to spend a few days in the little country town of Sudbury. As there is no hotel in the village, I took up my quarters in an old-fashioned farmhouse. My host, a worthy specimen of the New England farmer, took it upon himself to entertain me evenings with all the stories and traditions of the places I had seen in my rambles during the day. One morning I happened to visit the Wayside Inn, of Longfellow fame, and was allowed to go through the house, see the coffee room, the chamber where Lafayette slept, and the dance hall. I could not help thinking what merry times those old walls might tell of, if only they could speak. When my host had finished his supper that evening and had seated himself on the piazza, I told him of my visit to the inn, and the impression it made on me. Surely, I said, there must be some story or romance connected with the old house. Well, now, he said, there is a sort of story about the old place. When I was a boy, more'n 50 years ago, a white-faced old woman used to live there all alone. Us children were kind of afraid of her, but I never did think there was any reason for it. She was a sort of strange woman, looked as if she was always going to cry. She never said nothing to anyone. But she used to tend sick folks, and they do say she did splendid by them. They used to tell strange stories about her. Perhaps you'd like to hear some. And then he told me the sad story of this poor woman, the substance of which I am going to give you. It is only a farmhouse now, but 100 years ago few hostelries were more famous for their good cheer than the White Horse Tavern. It was at the height of its popularity in the time of the Revolution. Day and night the yard was filled with coaches, guests thronged to the passages and the coffee room. Far and wide were echoed the praises of the jovial landlord Howe, and his sprightly daughter Jerusha Howe's beauty was talked of the country round. The acknowledged belle of Sudbury, she was the envy of all the other girls. No one was so beautiful, so ready of speech. None could lead a reel so gracefully or dance a jig so divinely. She alone, of all Sudbury, had a spinet, the gift of her fond father, and often the passers-by might have heard lively airs and seen figures moving gracefully about in the dance-room in the wing of the tavern. Many suitors from Sudbury and the neighboring town paid their court to the heiress, happy the man who should win Jerusha and her spinet. Yet one bore himself as though he were already the happy possessor of her affections, and it seemed as if he had a right to his pretensions, for he appeared to have found favor in her eyes. Luther Grafton, the favored suitor, was a prosperous young farmer on the border of Marlborough. Inheriting a fine farm, the result of his father's pleasureless life, he lived alone, year by year increasing in prosperity. He was well made and handsome, some said. He could talk and hold his own with the best. In fact, he was just such a man as any spinster of Sudbury would have liked for her husband. A selectman of the town, it was whispered that he might be captain of the Marlborough Company. Would he not forget his patriotism in his love for Jerusha? The summer of 1777 had come. The old tavern had been wildly gay all winter, and was crowded day after day with guests coming and going. There had been many young volunteers from Boston. They were only too glad to accept the opportunity of dancing, even with a simple country girl. But many had been touched by Jerusha's beauty, more than they cared to own, and it was with regret that they left the old tavern. Now rumors were rife in Sudbury that some Frenchmen had come to Boston to take part in the colonial revolt, and that they might go through Sudbury on their journey. When these reports were confirmed, the old house was thrown into a whirl of excitement. The guest chambers were polished again and again. Jerusha herself spread the beds with the best linen, and saw that everything was in perfect order. Jerusha told her father that it would be a compliment to the guests to give a ball. To this the good man instantly assented and bade her look to all the necessary preparations. At last the eventful day came. Jerusha had busied herself all morning, and early in the afternoon went to her room to prepare for the guests' arrival. The time for the coach was come, and Squire Howe and his daughter, bowing and curtsying at the door, saw 3 foreign-looking young gentlemen alight, one of whom laughingly acknowledged the salute. He spoke in English, but with a strange accent. "I greet you, my lord, and you, mademoiselle," he said, and he smiled. In due time the ball began. There were many rustic belles present, but Jerusha Howe's beauty surpassed all. The French officers led the first dances with her, and then came Grafton. The latter was not pleased in having the others take precedence of him. He remonstrated angrily with his sweetheart, but she refused to allow him more than 3 dances. Sullenly he retired and watched the dance from the doorway, taking no part in the general merriment. Jerusha did not seem to miss him, but gloried in the attention of the young Frenchman. She was the acknowledged queen. The next day news came to the tavern that Grafton had accepted the captaincy of the Marlborough Company and had marched for New York. Poor Jerusha! She began to realize what she had lost in Grafton. "When he comes back again, I will make it right," she said. Soon after Grafton joined the Continental Army, Washington marched to Philadelphia, and near the city, on the 11th of September, the Battle of Brandywine was fought. A detachment of the army, in which was the Marlborough Company, taken at a disadvantage, made a brief stand. They soon broke and fled, but Grafton, who refused to run, was shot. News traveled slowly in those days, and it was weeks before accurate information could be obtained of those lost in battle. But one September morning, when Jerusha was sitting at her spinnet, the mail came and the paper was thrown into the coffee room. Jerusha was looking down the columns to see if she had known any of those killed, when her eye fell on a short item. Massachusetts, Captain Luther Grafton, Marlborough, Middlesex County, killed September 11th at Brandywine. That was all. She managed to walk to her room and throw herself on the bed. It was long before she left it. And then what a change! Jerusha Howe, the light-hearted belle of Sudbury, was no more, but Jerusha Hal, a silent, white-faced woman, lived in her stead. All her spirits had left her, and her former pleasures were pleasures no longer. The tavern became quiet, no more dances in the old ballroom. The room was deserted and used for storage. Jerusha merely existed now, waiting for time to do its work. For 30 years she lived on, doing little acts of charity, tending the sick, and making death easier for them. It was long ago. All the people of that time have passed away. Even the White Horse Tavern is a thing of the past. Few townspeople who pass the graveyard and see her plain stone know the story of Jerusha Howe, spinster. So that was the story of Jerusha Howe, spinster. It is an abridged version of the original story that I found in an old magazine published in 1887. It's a literary magazine, which means that the magazine publishes poetry and stories, both true and made up. Who was Jerusha Howe? I want to provide some background information on the real Jerusha Howe, and we're going to use some of that information to help us compare with the story that we just heard to try and figure out what's true and what's legend. So Jerusha Howe was born in 1797 and lived to be about 44 years of age. She died in 1842. She's a daughter of Adam Howe and Jerusha Balcom Howe. And Jerusha Balcom Howe, her mother, has the same first name, as you can tell, and she was born in 1767, and interestingly, she died the same year as Jerusha Howe. Jerusha is also the sister of Adam Howe Jr. and Lehman Howe, who were both innkeepers in what is today Longfellow's Wayside Inn. At the time it was called Howe's Tavern. And Lehman, her brother Lehman, inspired the character of the squire in a famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow titled Tales of a Wayside Inn. And Jerusha, like her two brothers, never married, and she never had children. Jerusha Howe is often referred to as the Belle of Sudbury when people talk about her. She was known for her grace, her hospitality, and her musical skills. So she was educated, meaning she could read and write. She had gone to school, and she had the first pianoforte in town, and people would come to the inn to listen to her play. She was a very talented musician. And legend also has it that she was the most beautiful woman in the area. The word belle means beautiful in French. So when somebody refers to a belle, they're often referring to a young woman who is considered beautiful. So given some of the information I just gave you about Jerusha Howe, did you notice any problems with the story? Did you hear anything that was inconsistent with what we know about Jerusha Howe? There are several details that I wanted to point out that aren't really consistent in the story with the true Jerusha Howe. So the first one has to do with the fact that Jerusha Howe was not alive in 1777 when the story takes place. That year is specifically referenced, and several times in the story they refer to the Revolutionary War. Jerusha also died at a fairly young age. She was 44, and the story begins with the tale of a white-faced old woman. And it's also referenced at the end of the story where they suggest that she lived to be much older. Now, Jerusha and her mother had the same name. They both had the name Jerusha. So there was a point where I thought maybe the story was about Jerusha the elder as opposed to the younger Jerusha. Because the elder Jerusha lived to be almost 75. The problem with that theory is that Jerusha's mother was married and had children, and so she couldn't be called a spinster. A spinster is a very unkind word for an unmarried woman. And Jerusha Balcom Howe was herself just a child in 1777. She would have only been about 10 years old. The last thing that I wanted to point out about Jerusha specifically in the story is there's a reference to a plain headstone in the graveyard. And Jerusha Howe has a very large, elaborate gravestone at Wadsworth Cemetery. You can go visit it. It's a really beautiful place to walk around. And her gravestone is large, and a lot of people leave flowers at it, so it's easy to find. So if you want to check that out, you can always go do that. And I also wanted to point out that there's a picture in this slide that shows a silhouette that you can see at the Wayside Inn that a lot of people often think is a silhouette of the younger Jerusha Howe, but it is actually a silhouette of her mother. So the two women are often kind of interchangeably referred to as one composite person. The other thing I wanted to point out from the story that is a little inconsistent with reality is the reference to the White Horse Tavern. So Longfellow's Wayside Inn was originally called Howe's Tavern, but it was often referred to as the Red Horse Tavern because of the red horse on the sign, and you can see that in this picture. In the 17th and 18th century, taverns often had animals on their signs to help travelers who could not read find them. And the story several times refers to the White Horse Tavern, which was a completely different tavern. It was most likely a tavern in Marlborough. And finally, there's the entire issue of Luther Grafton. And who was Luther Grafton? As far as I can tell, he's not a real person. No one by that name lived in Sudbury or Marlborough or all of Massachusetts in the 17 or 1800s, according to the public records that I looked through. If he was a prosperous young farmer, as the story suggests, or a captain in one of the Marlborough militia companies, we would have been able to find some information on him. Records were fairly well kept during this time period, especially in New England. So we should have found something if he was a real person. And none of the three Marlborough companies fought in the Battle of Brandywine, so that's completely made up. The legend of Jerusha Howe continues today. There are a lot of stories about her. She is still referred to as the Belle of Sudbury, and as I mentioned before, people often leave flowers on her grave at Wadsworth Cemetery. If you go there today, you'll probably see something, sometimes rocks in the shapes of hearts or flowers left at the base. People today still mention her broken heart. This story refers to a man in a neighboring town. Other stories mention an English gentleman who went back to England to prepare for a wedding and never returned. And so a lot of people think she was very sad and had a broken heart because of a long lost love. And a lot of people believe her ghost haunts old rooms in Longfellow's Wayside Inn. And they actually enjoy staying in her room and leaving her messages and leaving messages to the inn, just talking about their experiences in staying in her old room. So as you can see from the story that we heard today about Jerusha Howe, that legends are often based on real people, and that some parts of the stories are often true and other parts are made up. So they're a combination of elements of real history with exaggeration and made up stories. So I want you to just think about what legends of people today do you imagine in the future? Are there stories in your family that you think will continue for many generations? Are there stories of famous people in the news or celebrities that you think are going to be the legends of the future? Maybe you want to write some of these stories, just like the author of this story did in the 19th century.